In the last decade, Michigan has had a lot of notable quarterbacks. You had guys such as Denard Robinson and Devin Gardner, and then you had Wilton Spate, Shea Patterson, Cade McNamara, and most recently J.J. McCarthy. There was one guy who was stuck between all of those players, though, who largely gets forgotten despite having a pretty good season. He was one of the top quarterbacks in college football that year, was a great 5-year player, and ultimately gets forgotten a lot. In today's video, we're to go through who this guy is, talk about his journey, his Michigan career, and what ultimately happened to him after football. But before we get started, we're so close to 100k, so be sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and turn on notifications so you never miss when I upload. Now, let's get started. So you're probably wondering who the subject of today's video is, and it is none other than former Iowa and former Michigan quarterback Jake Rudock. But in order to understand what happened to Jake Rudock, we first need to go back in time. Jake was groomed to be a big-time quarterback from a young age, and this stemmed all the way back to his youth days in Florida. Eventually, he would get an opportunity to play big-time high school football in the Fort Lauderdale area, with him being a star at 2 major sports. He played both football and baseball, which meant he had a good arm, and he became a quarterback. Rudock eventually arrived to the national power of St. Thomas Aquinas, and he quickly showed off a really high ceiling as their quarterback. Future NFL players such as Giovanni Bernard, Philip Dorsett, James White, and Rashad Green were there, so things were easy on him. They could also bail him out if he struggled, but he would have to wait his turn to get on the field there. As a junior, he was a quiet leader, and he established himself and guided the team to a 13-1 record. Along the way, he threw for 2,000 yards and 34 touchdowns, as colleges from across the country watched this impressive prospect. His arm strength, athletic ability, and decision-making were the main traits that big-time programs saw in Rudock, and he'd have plenty of options to choose from when it came time to make a decision. He went 4-0 in nationally televised games and never lost his cool. His high school coach said, quote, "He was always composed and he never lost his composure. He was always the same no matter how good or how bad things were going." Ultimately, Rudock would pick Iowa over a ton of other schools, as he said, quote, "I'm going to the University of Iowa. They're a great program, have a tremendous coaching staff, and I have a chance to play on a team that fits exactly what I do." Also, according to reports, it seems that Ferentz thought that Rudock could change the course of the program and the position there, so they offered him an opportunity to be a program changer. He ended up picking the Hawkeyes over Wisconsin, Colorado, and Illinois, but Wisconsin was the only real competition to Iowa. His stock probably could have been higher on the recruiting market, but he decided to commit early, which stopped other schools from pursuing him. Ferentz was relieved. He said, quote, "He may have been recruited a little bit more heavily if he had not been committed this season. We are thrilled. Just all the intangible things that he possesses, we're excited for him to get to Iowa City." Iowa seemingly struck gold, as the recruiting coordinator said, quote, "Jake was the top guy on our board and a guy we were able to get done. I know people were worried that he was going to be bouncing around, but he knew our commitment to him, and I think he felt the same way about us throughout the entire process." Rudock was excited for the next steps in his career, but he first had one more game to play. His final high school game was the Florida Class 5A state championship game, and they won 29-7. Because of that, they would finish atop the national polls, and they would win the national championship that year. This was a huge achievement for St. Thomas Aquinas and for him, and he hoped to bring the winning ways and attitude to Iowa City, and scouts agreed that he could be a big deal. According to 24/7 Sports, Rudock was a 3-star recruit, the number 23 pro-style quarterback, and the 625th best player in the class of 2011. So how would the underrated quarterback gem end up doing at Iowa? While Rudock would have potential down the road, he would have to wait a few seasons before he would ever play. Going into 2013, there would be a quarterback battle between him and young player CJ Beathard. Ultimately, Rudock was the safer option, so Ferentz decided to roll with him. Rudock had an interesting season. Threw for 256 yards and 2 touchdowns in their first game, but ended up getting upset to Northern Illinois, which was not the best way to start your career. After that, he had 2 touchdowns and one over Missouri State, before he'd have 3 touchdowns and a victory over their rival Iowa State. So far, he looked pretty decent, but Iowa was kind of in trouble. Luckily, they would turn it on with back-to-back wins over Western Michigan and Minnesota before they get into the heart of Big Ten play. They ended up losing close games to both Michigan State and Ohio State, and in that matchup against the Buckeyes, Rudock threw for 3 touchdowns. He had his best game of the year on the biggest stage, and would have a pretty mild end of the season. He'd help them beat Northwestern. They would lose to number 24 Wisconsin, but they would win 4 out of their last 5 games, with Rudock finishing with 7 touchdowns in those 4 games. They beat Purdue, Michigan, and Nebraska to finish the regular season with an 8-4 record. Despite that weird loss to Northern Illinois and a couple of scares, Iowa had a pretty successful first year. Because of that, Rudock would lead them to the Outback Bowl, where they'd eventually lose by 1 touchdown to number 16 LSU. On the season, Rudock finished with 2,383 yards, 18 touchdowns, and 13 interceptions. He also had 5 scores on the ground. It was pretty good for being a first-year starter, but as you can obviously pick up, those 13 interceptions were problematic. No player should struggle to turn the ball over that much. There was a lot of potential though. Going into 2014, Rudock was once again the starter, and they'd have a couple of scares to start out the season again. They beat Northern Iowa by 1 possession, and then only beat Ball State by 4 points. Both of those games came at home, and while Rudock did combine for nearly 600 yards and 4 touchdowns, it just seemed they couldn't reach that next level. Things became really bad as they ended up losing at home to Iowa State, and this is not the same Cyclones program we are used to. There was fire underneath Rudock, and some were calling for Beathard to get a chance to play. On the road against Pittsburgh, Rudock would end up getting hurt, but they would still win 24-20. He'd missed their game against Purdue before he would bounce back. He threw for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns in a nice win over Indiana, before having a season-high 317 yards in a loss to Maryland. After that, they would blow out Northwestern, and then they would lose to Minnesota. It seemed that Rudock would go back and forth, and Iowa would also go back and forth. One game they'd be on, the next game they'd be off. Rudock would have 3 touchdowns and a road win over Illinois, before at least finishing the season strong. He had nearly 400 yards and 3 touchdowns and a 2-point loss to Wisconsin, and then ended up losing to Nebraska in overtime. While Rudock did have a strong end to the season, many were starting to wonder if he really had much of a future at Iowa. They get selected to play in the Tax Slayer Bowl against Tennessee, where he'd go 2 of 8 for 32 yards. He ended up finishing the season with 2,436 yards, 16 touchdowns, and 5 picks. While his numbers weren't awful, it just seemed that Iowa wanted to go in a different direction. After that Tennessee game, Rudock would get a call that would change his career. Ferentz called to inform him that they'd be moving forward with CJ Beathard, and his initial reaction was, quote, "I'm going to win the job back," but eventually, he decided he was going to use his grad transfer year. He ended up choosing Michigan and had this to say, quote, "Michigan had a lot to offer: the history of the program, the tradition of academic excellence, and Coach Jim Harbaugh. He's a guy who played the position and has proven he can win at any level. And then throw in the fact that I have a relationship with Coach Jed Fish, and Michigan had the perfect formula to convince me that despite my attachment to the Iowa coaching staff, it was time to move on." Some Iowa fans were upset with Jake, but you could blame Ferentz for that. He wanted to stay a Hawkeye for life, but Ferentz made him the backup. Rudock would arrive at Ann Arbor and would become Jim Harbaugh's first quarterback. He worked relentlessly to gain the trust of his teammates and coaches, while also gaining valuable experience in the medical world off the field, and this was for his career after football. So how would he end up doing at Michigan? Well, Rudock had more talent around him, but his numbers stayed pretty much the same. He ended up throwing 3 interceptions in a Week 1 loss on the road to Utah, and this immediately made some fans not happy with him. But he'd end up bouncing back. He led them to 5 straight victories, which included wins at home against Oregon State, number 22 BYU, and number 13 Northwestern. He led them to 3 straight shutouts, and while he wasn't putting up huge numbers, Rudock was getting the job done. In mid-October, they'd have a matchup with number 7 Michigan State, and this game will go down in history. Rudock pretty much did nothing in that game, but all the punter had to do was just kick the ball away, and they would have won, but as we know, he had trouble with the snap, and Michigan State won. This was awful, and things were very close the next week as well. They ended up stopping Minnesota at the goal line and won 29-26, and then had to go to double overtime against Indiana. This was by far the best game of Rudock's career, as in that game he threw for 440 yards and 6 touchdowns. This stat just pops off the page in his box score, and I remember that game clearly. He ended up having a game-tying touchdown to go to overtime, and this ended up being his best game of his career. After that, he combined for 3 touchdowns and a win over Penn State, where he'd have his first and only matchup with Ohio State. Despite the Buckeyes being ranked number 8 in the country, Ohio State took him to the woodshed and won 42-13. Rudock would get them to the Citrus Bowl, where they'd play against number 19 Florida, and he'd finish his career on a high note. He had nearly 300 yards and 3 scores against the Gators, finishing the season with 3,017 yards, 20 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions, with 4 more scores on the ground. Rudock had the physical traits to be an NFL quarterback, but by no means was he going to be a first-rounder. Many scouts saw him as a career backup, which is why there was a lot of buzz about him being a late-round steal. Ultimately, he was drafted in the 6th round by the Detroit Lions, and he was just basically going to hold the clipboard. He became the 3rd-string quarterback in 2016, and ended up sitting behind Matthew Stafford and Dan Orlovsky. In 2017, they would draft Brad Kaya in the later rounds, and with him getting waived, Rudock got an opportunity to actually play against the Ravens. This came in Week 13, as he went 3 for 5 for 24 yards and 1 interception. While it isn't the greatest stat line in the world, he at least got an opportunity to get on an NFL field, and that was the first and last time. After that, he'd end up signing with the Miami Dolphins in 2019, but then he bounced around from the waivers to the practice squad, and then was done. After retiring from football on August 2nd, 2021, he was accepted into Michigan's School of Medicine, where he will now pursue a career as a doctor. Honestly, Rudock is a forgotten player. He was decent for Iowa and actually had a pretty good season for Michigan, and ended up making it to the NFL and saw the field. He got paid to be a backup, got a really good degree, had some productive seasons, and will go down as a huge winner in my book. That is what happened to Jake Rudock, and I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. But before we go, don't forget to leave your thoughts down below. Let me know what player I should cover next. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen, including my video about what happened to Brandon Peters. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.